Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Has Jordan. Allen shakes. Gray gets two.
Gilmore on snap. Oh, brother. Lead Toledo Artists. You get 21. 4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello, and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann. With me, as always, is Rich Kraetsch, and we are here with Seth Partnow of Nylon Calculus. Seth, welcome back.
Good to be here.
So we are continuing our top 50 series. Today we are going to look at Vince Carter and basic breakdown for Vince. He is 51st in win shares, 139th in win shares per 48, 50th in box score plus minus, and 27th in value over replacement player. On the Bill Simmons pyramid from his book, he is 89th. And in the Slam 500 greatest players of all time, he is 99th. He had one time was on the All-NBA second team, one time on the third team. One time he was in the top 10 in the league in win shares per 48, three times top 10 in value over replacement player. He was a productive scorer, probably the best dunker of his generation. I could probably even get rid of the probably there. He also, later in his career, he transitioned into a very good role player, unlike some of his high-scoring peers. Some of his negatives are that things did not go well at the end in Toronto, and he did sort of peak early, and then didn't really have many years sort of as with superstar production after his early years in Toronto. So, Seth, how do you feel about Vince Carter as a top 50 candidate?
I think that the kind of the coda to his career has probably helped him, and I think that's a good thing. He was a guy who probably got a little unfairly maligned for not basketball stuff, almost in kind of the Chris Webber category of a guy who, quote unquote, should have been better, and so that kind of causes people to undersell what he actually achieved. And obviously, you have to give, just in terms of influence, kind of have to give a little bit of a bump there, and certainly even through the mid 2000s, I mean, when you, not that, the kind of the polls of NBA players are always the most accurate barometer of anything, but he was always a guy who elicited almost somewhere between respect and fear from his peers, like well past the time when that was maybe objectively warranted. So that has to count for something, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked a little about his transition into a role player. It hurts some of his overall numbers in some sense, but in terms of the way he, the portrayal of him, do you think that does help him a lot? I mean, I absolutely think it does, because here's a guy who, if he rode off into the sunset, after those New Jersey Nets years and, 2006, 2007, that little era, it's similar to kind of Allen Iverson, how he just kind of petered out real quick. Instead, he's went to Phoenix, had a pretty good year, a few years, a few as like a kind of a star, and then more sort of transitioning in the role player, then goes to Dallas and is pretty much exclusively a role player. Now he's kind of bouncing around a little bit, but doing it. But it's in the sense that I wonder for top 50 candidacy, I think it helps him in our eyes of how we view him now. But as a top 50, I don't know. In terms of like trying to take his whole legacy and lump it in and everything he has, I don't know if it hurts or helps. I really don't.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Seth.
No, to the extent it takes some of the narrative about him was doesn't care enough about basketball, and that's a lot of that stuff gets I can only imagine how hot takey Twitter would have been about Vince Carter going to graduation or something like that. But I think that the fact that he was able to become kind of this elder statesman and solid role player, and morphing into someone who's going to be a fantastic TV analyst and stuff like that, I think it kind of gives the lie to the notion that he didn't care enough about basketball. And I think that, when you remove that as part of, well, if he cared as much as he should have, he would have been better. When you remove that and can just, examine what he did, then that it doesn't hurt him. I'll say it that way.
Yeah, well, and I think, if you're going to compare him to sort of like a contemporary like McGrady and maybe even Iverson to like a certain extent, I mean, I think that the fact that he was able to hold on and have productive years toward the end of his career, like he didn't have the peaks of either of those guys, I don't think, but especially McGrady. But I do think that having that longevity and also, I think that the later part of his career, like you said, sort of rehabbed his image because it was really bad, like in the way he left Toronto and the way he basically admitted on quitting on the team. And I mean, his reputation was really, not very good for a few seasons. Even though, he produced well, he was still, very good. But I wonder if that I was surprised looking at it that he only made two All-NBA teams, 1 second, 1/3. I was expecting, a few more than that for being a guy who, was considered a superstar for a while. And I don't know if maybe just that was a little bit of voters holding that against him or,
it has to be.
Yeah.
It has to, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, because even in New Jersey and even that year in Orlando, he produced pretty well. That team kind of fell apart a little bit, but still, I mean, he, and then, that transition to the role player stuff, that was a little bit of a rough transition at first, but he definitely did well. I guess the question is it better to burn out or fade away?
And that's I don't think it was, I'm trying to remember. I think it was Nate Duncan was talking with Kevin Pelton about, on their podcast last week about the greatest teams of all time. And the topic of Kareem came up. And how, like, Kareem, spent a decade as a very good but no longer great player, and how that kind of maybe detracts a little bit from the perception of. And then you look and see what he did in the seven, like, this is like 1988 when he's still like a solid player, and then you look at what he did in like 1972 and how absurdly dominant he was. Not comparing Vince Carter to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but kind of how that the kind of the late model. Hit timely big shots. Vince Carter maybe obscures some of the images of the score in any way imaginable, plus dunk in your face kind of late 90s, early 2000s version of the player, which was a fairly terrifying offensive force.
Yeah. A few, I'll do real quickly his comparables, air position, and then, obviously just his position all time. 11th in points per 36 is air in position. 29th in win shares per 48. He does a lot better in the raw stats. So 7th in overall win shares, and then 6th in value over replacement player. Position all time, of course, is shooting guard. 31st in points per 36, 46th in win shares per 48, 15th in win shares, and 12th in value over replacement players. So, not elite level stuff, but pretty solid, and a guy who, again, like I agree, Jason, with you that it's you look at like the all NBA teams and you think of a guy who from 2000 until really pretty much 2005 was a super productive player and did a lot on the court, did a lot and just didn't really see much reward for it. You kind of have to wonder if there is something in terms of the way he was, because especially, the conference he was in as well. He was in, a weak East and was able to really, really, really stand out in terms of, especially in those Toronto years, really stand out as one of the best players in that conference during, that period, and yet doesn't seem to really get many of the rewards for it on either end. So it's very interesting. I don't know about him, though, top 50 candidate. One of my favorite players of all time, a guy that I loved, watching those videos, the early, downloading, pirated videos on Napster, Kazaa, whatever the hell terrible spyware program I was downloading on, where I was like, ooh, a .exe of Vince Carter dunks, like this will be good. And then crap, I now have a horrible virus all over my computer. But I used to get videos of all the time, and I have a jersey, and he's one of my favorite players growing up. But overall, looking at a top 50, I don't know. He'd be a tough one. He'd be really, really tough for me to say yes. I pretty safely have him out of that top 50, but I'm curious on your guys' thoughts.
So here's the thing is, the way Vince Carter gets talked about is almost like a glorified, more athletic Jamal Crawford. And I think that's, selling short, like all the other things he did. I mean, if you look at, through his peak, he's averaging, six boards, four assists a game from a wing spot, and that's he's doing much more than just scoring, and that I think that those things that kind of the other things he brought to the table, and this is kind of get lost amidst kind of the Toronto stuff and the dunking and the scoring pyrotechnics, is how just good and all around basketball player he was in terms of his feel for the game and his playmaking and just ability to kind of do things on the court beyond just scoring, and that's I don't know if I'm necessarily advocating him for top 50 of all time, but I feel like those things need to be, discussed and recognized, that he was much more than just this superstar scorer through and even a little bit past his prime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of looking at some of the guys that he was behind for his career, and obviously, once LeBron, because I guess he's sort of in the guard or forward spots depending on the season. So once LeBron is in, he's going to be behind him. He's going to be behind Kobe. Obviously, there's the rise of Nash. There's Iverson. There's Arenas for a few years. There's Dwayne Wade, Chauncey Billups, McGrady. So, he certainly belonged in relatively in that class or relatively close to that class. But I do think Paul Pierce, a bunch of guys who I can't say that he definitely should have beaten them, maybe here and there, but he's behind a really high caliber group of guys too. So yeah, he definitely, there are probably individual times where he could have been voted those teams, but looking at kind of who was, it doesn't look too ridiculous to me.
That's fair.
Yeah, but which is sort of it's not necessarily like an argument against him. It's just more like, even if he's not being punished because of that, or even if he is, the crop of guys that he's behind, it's just a really tough group of guys, and he's still really good in that group. But I hadn't looked at that closely before, but just looking at it, it's like, wow, we were very blessed in the late 2000s and, even onward for the quality of play we've had in the league. So let's see. Anything else, Rich or Seth?
Not really. Yeah. Seth, do you have anything?
No, you have to, you're talking about Vince Carter. You talked about, I think everyone, when you kind of amended to no longer probably the best dunker of his era, I think everyone in their mind's eye was making the "it's over" sign from his first dunk in that dunk contest. And so that's the kind of just the indelible imagery of that contest, and, the dunk leaping over Frederick Weiss. And maybe you'll be able to remember this one, but my personal favorite of mine was when he was in New Jersey, and he just a ball came out to him on an offensive rebound, and he to gather the ball, he goes behind the back with it, then comes down the lane and goes chest to chest with Alonzo Mourning.
Yeah,
and Zoe falls, and he cocks it back, and just
it's an explosion. Yeah, a nuke goes off in that arena.
And that's and that was slightly past overall athletic peak Vince Carter. And he could still bring that one back, and that's
what's funny. Oh, sorry, not to interrupt, but it's kind of funny where a lot of us remember, myself included, those Toronto Raptors years. You see all these videos, and you look up Vince Carter highlights or whatever, and you see the first thing you think of is a lot of Toronto stuff. You might think of that one Zoe thing in New Jersey. If you watch an overall video of his dunks, he was still a really good dunker. Even in New Jersey, he was still a great slasher. And people just sort of, for whatever reason, decided after he left Toronto, he just became, not as athletic, kind of the bum. He didn't care about winning. He did all this sort of stuff. And none of it's true whatsoever. No. When you watch these videos, a lot of his dunks in New Jersey are every bit as good as the ones in Toronto. But just the fact that he was such a dynamo when he first came out with Toronto, that people sort of assume, oh man, after those first 5 years or 3 or 4 years or whatever, Vince didn't quite have the jump he used to. And you see stuff like that where the guy is, if you slow down that dunk over Zoe, he's elbow above the rim still, and he's in his late peak at that point, quote unquote. And it's just insane. It's funny how a lot of narrative can sort of surround a guy, and I think you get that a lot with Vince Carter. He's very heavy in that, where people just decided this guy was a quitter and stopped being athletic, stopped being as dynamic as he used to be, and he was always kind of the same. Like, he didn't really change all that much. It's just kind of funny how they can kind of go that way.
The guys who kind of, I think we see that a lot, guys who kind of reach that, you talked about the guys, there's that strata of like, the 10 guys you're expecting to finish the All-Star game, maybe, is kind of where you'd put it. And the guys who bubble up to just below that, they kind of tend to get replaced in our consciousness by kind of the new hotness. Even though without them necessarily going, and this happened, I think this happened to Paul Pierce, another guy you mentioned, and he had the good fortune of kind of that 08 Celtics team coming together around him, and to kind of rejuvenate the idea of him as kind of a winner, and that was something that never necessarily really happened for Carter as much.
Yeah, and I would put Pierce ahead of Carter in the sort of in my tier. If I'm thinking about it, he would definitely be a guy who I would probably put in first, and probably that has a strong role in that. I mean, if that hadn't happened for Pierce, I definitely would look at him differently. I don't know how much I would look at him differently, but I definitely would look at him differently. And
on one hand, that's fair, because I mean that's something Pierce achieved. Sure. But on the other hand, that's an opportunity that I don't think that necessarily through any fault of his own, kind of in his late prime, Carter was never in that kind of spot. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, that's completely fair. At age 30 for the Nets in 07, he averaged 25, 6, and almost 5 on, and he shot 35% from 3-point line. So he could fill it up.
He could still bring it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So, anything else?
I have nothing.
All right. Well, thank you again, Seth, for joining us. And you can find us at hardwoodparoxysm.com. And also you can check out our new forums at overandbacknba.com, where we chat about a lot of classic NBA basketball. So check that out. We're also on Twitter at overandbacknba and Facebook at the same. So until next time, thanks for listening.